The next hour and a half, we're going to have this amazing panel be available to answer your questions and to offer some of their own thoughts on things. I'll tell you how this is going to work. First off, I'm sure you all join with me in having learned an awful lot over the last couple of days. And one of many things I learned is what I'm now calling the Kathleen rule, which is save a third for solutions. So we're going to apply that to the panel. It's an hour and a half long panel. We're going to save the last half hour to hear from each of the panelists on what we can all do, all of us in this room, going forward to make a difference. In the first hour, however, we're going to engage in questions from you. And here's how it's going to work. You can ask a general question. General questions are not going to be answered by all 8 of these folks. If they have an interest, they're going to raise their hand. I'm going to identify them. Maybe 3 or 4 people might chime in on a particular question. We'll see how it goes. You can also ask a focused question for a particular panelist, for that person to answer. And it may be that 1 or 2 members of the panel may want to respond as well. And if they indicate and I choose them, they'll have that opportunity. So we're going to see how this works. I'm a little nervous about it, but we'll give it a try. So we can start right in, and we have in the balcony with mic 3. Go ahead.
My name is Ursa Beckford from College of the Atlantic, and bear with me, I have a very short 2-part question. The first one is for Mr. Schumacher. I'm wondering, considering all the work you've done encouraging access to healthy foods, how you felt about the Coca-Cola advertisement yesterday and the fact that Coca-Cola was offered in the break just now. And then my general question for the panel is coming back to Friday night when Fred was talking about how our current system is designed around, as I recall, maximum efficiency for maximum short-term economic return. I'm wondering if on the panel you'd say you have fundamental disagreements about that system and whether we should scrap it for something new.
Go ahead.
I think I did see that Coca-Cola ad, but it looks like Coke is changing the way it's doing its advertising these days with a little more of the YouTube. When you go to the movies, they have Coca-Cola has very vibrant, but it doesn't, the issue I think is coming really back to the wider issue of sugary drinks and the issue of, as I mentioned earlier, taxes. And I was a little surprised, not so much Coca-Cola, but the Grocery Manufacturers Association the other day. That surprised me a lot when they really attacked the Mexican president for the 8 peso tax on sugary drinks. That surprised me. I think the ad was funny, but the more serious one is the the encouragement by a number of governments in Latin America to begin to deal with obesity and the pushback by certain groups. That is a bit more concerning. Thank you.
No? Anything on the second part of the question? Anyone? Yes, Andrew at the end.
Sure. I don't think we should view the problem as an effort to maximize efficiency. Generally, efficiency is a good thing. It means you get more at lower cost. The real problem is the second part of the question, which is, are we doing it in a way that ignores important costs, and in particular future costs? And the answer to that is clearly yes. We're clearly doing that with our management of water resources all around the world. We're clearly doing that on the climate. We're really very, very bad at having today's humans make decisions that take into account tomorrow's humans. And we need to be better at that. And that's a really big challenge. Those are real important costs that we're passing down. And the problem isn't that this is new. The problem is that now we're able to do it in a way that really threatens future generations. In the past, we've been more than happy to compromise future generations for present generations, but we haven't been, as the human race, in a position to do it in ways that fundamentally harms the planet long term, or that exhaust natural resources on the scale we're capable of doing it today. So we've got to a point where we can no longer sustain this practice of borrowing from the future, or stealing from the future is more accurate.
We have Jim and Rob both want to chime in as well.
Very good questions, Ursa, by the way. I think that one of the challenges is maximization versus sort of optimization, right? And maximization of a single parameter that you're concerned about, whether it's calories or profit or efficiency in that narrow sense, versus recognizing that agriculture and food touch on so many different areas that are of social and environmental concern, water and biodiversity and climate and livelihoods, this whole range of different things, and saying, well, how can we balance, how can we sort of have an optimal range of outcomes across those different parameters that are all important. I think one of the challenges is that, markets tend to reward one of those parameters more than others. And so are there ways to either get markets to recognize this more optimal multifunctional nature of agriculture and food, or or have some social way of society deciding we're going to rig the game so that rather than maximizing something maybe at the cost of future generations, we are able to have this more multifunctional set of outcomes that are beneficial.
Good. Rob?
I would agree that the real problem is too much short-term thinking rather than long-term thinking. I don't think the problem is seeking efficiencies or high productivity. In fact, if you look at the performance of conventional agriculture in the United States, it's prospered by reducing input use per bushel of production. If you look at USDA data, since 1980 in corn production in the United States, for every bushel produced, land use has gone down by about 30%, energy use has gone down by about 30%, irrigation water use has gone down by about 30%. It's sometimes not appreciated that conventional farming is making money today not by just boosting yields, but by making more precise applications of input and reducing costly interventions like tillage. Chemical use, people don't quite understand. Pesticide use in American farming peaked in 1973. Fertilizer use peaked in 1980, even though total production has increased by 40% since 1980. I think these are efficiency gains that have a sustainability gain that accompany them.
Kathleen, did I see your hand? No.
Yeah.
Yes, okay. You get the final word on this one.
Sure. Well, Rob gave me a lot to think about. I don't necessarily agree with everything that was just said, but I do want to embrace the notion of efficiency. So Shelley shared with us the story this morning of lean, finely textured beef, pink slime. And I was actually the first person at USDA who got in front of the cameras and took a very unpopular position when things started to rock and roll in the press. And I said, it's safe to eat. Because it was safe to eat. It is safe to eat. Is it what I want to eat? Is it what I want my kids to eat? Is it appealing? No, but here's the thing. It just shows how the industry has gotten so they use every single bit of protein. It's so efficient. And then I look at my guys that I've been working with for decades in sustainable agriculture, and they're raising their animals, and they're only selling the best cuts, and they have no access to rendering, and there's just a lot of loss there. And so my challenge to everyone in the audience who cares about sustainability is to think about efficiency and how that's built into any kind of system that we're setting up.
Great point. We're going to go to mic 1 right over here.
Dan Dibner from Rockport. So we've talked about the Farm Bill now, and we've heard a variety of positions on the Farm Bill. More than $950 billion, in which more than 75% is on food assistance. In America, 1 out of 5 people are now on food assistance. To some extent, it would be like the whole balcony being on food assistance. And we listened to the panel, and they described the importance of the difference between calorie intake and nutritional food. And yet we empower a nation to spend $750+ billion without any indication as how those funds should be spent. And the question, the nail in the forehead is, if we look at exactly where the food is being spent and what is being purchased, we see it every day. And then we look at the numbers of population growth in the United States. where our population growth is actually occurring. And we realize that we're not just making bad food judgment with this, but we're actually creating a condition where our population sectors are being affected by it. I'd be curious, especially from you, Kathleen, help us understand the nail in the forehead between empowering $750 billion worth of food expenditure without even beginning the discussion on what one is allowed to purchase with taxpayer-funded assistance.
Sure. I would love to address your question because embedded in it, I think, is the answer to why there haven't been restrictions placed on SNAP dollars, food stamp dollars. I have said, leaving the administration, when I could reclaim my own voice and say whatever the heck I think, and by the way, I'm enjoying that quite a bit. When you're deputy secretary, anything you say goes back to the president, the first lady, the whole institution, and it was a privilege and honor to have that job, and I wouldn't take back a day of it, but there are compromises that you make in terms of your own individual voice. But as soon as I left USDA, I said, I would grant that waiver to New York City, to the mayor, to restrict SNAP dollars for sugary beverages in particular. But here's the problem, and one of the reasons that holds USDA from doing that is there is a certain assumption, I think, around the country that people who are poor, who are SNAP recipients, make demonstrably different diet choices than the rest of people. And we have very strong studies done by USDA and by outside economists that show that poor people are making the same bad choices the rest of us are. And they're very compelling studies. And part of it, the concern at USDA, right or wrong, in terms of making decisions, is protective of and fighting back against this image of the African American welfare mother who's in line with chips and soda. That's just not the majority of what's going on with our SNAP dollars. In fact, most SNAP recipients are children and disabled, and there are a whole lot of people who are eligible for SNAP who don't take advantage of them, primarily older people, elderly. Only about 35% of elderly low-income people are taking advantage of SNAP dollars. Depression-era, proud people, but we know that they're living quiet lives of hunger, and that's just horrible in a country that they helped build. So I hate anything that demonizes the SNAP program, what we're doing with those taxpayer dollars. Gus threw out a challenge this morning about looking at that pie chart, and now it's 80% of USDA's budget. Wow, nutrition assistance through the multiple programs. That's also school meals and TFAP. WIC is our largest discretionary program at USDA. How do we say that at the same time these support, these lifelines to families, to young children, to disabled people are critical, but how do we improve them? How do we be innovative with them? How do we get win-wins like having those nutrition benefits redeemed at farmers markets? So there's also the building of the local food movement. I think it's timely to ask the question about scrutinizing those dollars, doing better with those dollars. But again, I think that we need to have those conversations in a tone of understanding about how people must feel if they're on SNAP, and how that whole program has been sort of, particularly in these last 6 months when it was the key stress point in concluding the 2014 Farm Bill, how people feel about how they're being talked about in the press and by their politicians. It hasn't been a good time.
Yes, Fred, please.
Yeah, let me just add to that. I think one of the things that, and we heard a lot of talk this morning about power in terms of influence in the food system. And one thing that I think maybe is important for us all to understand out of this group, and that is that in the food business, people have a lot of power. We had an extension specialist at Iowa State University a few years ago that did a research project because she wanted to find out, she was convinced that ordinary people had a lot of power when it comes to determining the food system. So she had her students go out and the assignment was to go into a typical supermarket and ask the manager of the supermarket to get a particular product in the store, because the general wisdom was, if you want to get a product in, you got to spend $50,000 for shelf space or something like that. And she didn't believe that was necessarily true. What she found was, invariably, when 15 people went into the same supermarket in the same week and asked for a particular product, that product would invariably end up in the supermarket.
Yeah.
Now, in order for it to stay on the shelf, of course, it had to sell, quite naturally. And she pointed out then that the reason that people have so much power in food is, if you're in the computer business and you lose a customer, you can always get your existing customers to buy an extra one or to upgrade more often. Same thing's true with automobiles. That's not true with food, because if you lose a food customer, you can't get your existing customers to just eat more. And that's a tremendous impact. And if you think about what's been happening just recently with companies like Smithfield Foods and General Mills, et cetera, and the kind of changes that they're making, they're listening to the power of people who are buying their product. That's why they're making the changes. So don't forget that, because there's a lot of things that we all learned in this conference, that can make us a little, discouraged. There's nothing we can do about this. You all, each individually, with a little bit of organization and planning, have a lot of power to make things change.
Great point. Great point. We're going to go to a question from one of the satellite venues. We have missed the boat by not addressing population issues, specifically limits of growth or overpopulation. Have we? Anyone wish to speak to this? Andrew.
Sure. So I have a view that is unpopular almost everywhere, which is that there's no disputing that Malthus got it right. The question is just a matter of timing. And we don't know whether we're at the point where he's right, that is, that the geometric growth in population is outstripping the inevitably arithmetic ability to extract resources. He has to be right in the sense that though technology can dramatically increase, let's say, food yields, there's only so much on the planet. And so at some point, but I have no idea whether we're near some critical point. I just know that eventually he'll be right. But the population issue is clearly a huge, huge issue, and it's enormously important to this topic and to many other topics. The dilemma is that it's very difficult to talk about everything at once. If you were to have a conference on population, my guess is you would spend a lot of time on issues that are critical to that, but not as obviously critical to food in the sense that we haven't addressed them. For example, the rights of women to reproductive choice, the ability, or women's rights writ large, that is education, elementary school education for girls, access to reproductive technologies, choice in marriage, both to get in and to get out of marriage. All of these things, those are going to be enormously important if the goal is to curb population growth in a way that is not oppressive. The same is true of economic growth. Economic growth, though from low levels of growth, there can be a spike in population with economic growth. We know that healthy economic growth leads to more stable or a lower population growth. So those are critically important, and obviously more mouths to feed means more food. We haven't talked about it much, though I'm not sure I'm prepared to complain about that, because though it's incredibly important, I think it's very hard to fit into the box of food and water because it sort of swamps it, and maybe that's a reason to talk about it more, I'm not sure. So I guess I'm sort of apologizing while agreeing with the premise of the question.
Well done. Yes, Dave.
Yeah, just a comment, and I don't remember which of the speakers it was, but I believe there was some discussion of it, and it was the issue that if you do have sustainable development in agricultural systems in the developing world, many of those individuals are actually women, farmers, and by increasing their economic viability, you tend to have results that lead in a slowing of population growth. So, as was mentioned during Rob's presentation, if we have leaders at the national level in sub-Saharan Africa and otherwise that are investing more in ag development, that would likely result in a slowing of population growth. But I'm sure there's other views on that subject. But I think it was talked about a little bit, though I agree it could have been discussed more, and there is obviously a major challenge in that area. So,
anyone else? We're going to go then to Mike 2, right front.
Hi, I'm John Davidson from Camden, and I address it to Kathleen. We've had a conversation about how we're going to feed people in the future. $9 billion people in many years, and the challenges that the reduced availability of farmland for growing the foods. And yet, apparently 40% of our corn crop goes to ethanol. And for Kathleen, just if you could tell us whether or not the new Farm Bill continues the subsidy for ethanol, and whether that makes sense from either an economic point of view or an ethical point of view.
The 2014 Farm Bill continues in slightly different ways support for commodity crops, of which corn is one. But the real game in ethanol the last couple of years, this is not an area I specialize in. If any of my fellow panelists want to correct me or give friendly amendments to what I say, the part of the game was lost when the tax credit for ethanol expired, and that was a big. I mean, we always think about what are we spending our money on, but I always urge people to say, what are we doing on the revenue side of the books, where it's money that we choose not to take in. For the students in the room, there's this great book, I really mean it, called Tax Expenditure Budgeting by Stanley Surrey of Harvard Law School. And my first job out of college was I wrote a piece of legislation that Massachusetts adopted to have a tax expenditure budget. So you have some transparency about what's going on the revenue side. So anyhow, that was a body blow for ethanol, followed by a lot of issues around EPA and what they were going to require in terms of fuel standards. And there's been some backing off on a more aggressive approach there. So I think the ethanol industry is getting the message that they need to become more competitive without government support if they're going to continue. Did ethanol put more pressure and change other industries? Yeah, I mean, the ethanol boom has been very clearly documented in the last few years. So we may be easing our way out of that right now.
Anyone else on ethanol? Costas.
Just one of the unintended consequences of the ethanol boom in the U.S. has been getting African countries to realize that they can't continue depending on food aid from the U.S. anymore. And it's become one of the sources of basically political support for getting African countries to think about investing in their own agriculture.
And I'll just jump on that. One of the bright lights in food aid in our country, you talk to a man on the street, you think we give 20% of our budget to other countries. I mean, it's so disproportionate to the reality. We do very little worldwide compared to our capacity. But one of the things that we're trying to do in agricultural food aid is, rather than sending our commodities to country X, try to then provide cash dollars to country X to help build their own food system, because I know that this is a very globally oriented audience. You know the history. Many times our efforts to help has displaced efforts to build local sources of food, and that's been distorting and devastating for small-scale farmers in particular. So I know that USAID and USDA are working together as part of the Feed the Future initiative. We've had a few countries where there have been some great pilot work, Tanzania being one of them, and I think that there's a real desire to upscale that.
Great. Let's go to another offsite question from one of our satellite venues. What effect will the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement have on U.S. international agriculture? Great question. Who wants to tackle that one? Anyone? I thought Rob might. Oh, Rob and Jim.
Rob, you go first.
We don't know because there's no agreement.
That's what I was going to say. And it's secret.
And President Obama has been trying to get authority from the Congress to negotiate an agreement that will then be subjected to a simple up-down vote on a time deadline basis in the Congress. This is so-called fast-track authority. But his own party doesn't want to give him that authority. And if he doesn't have that authority, foreign countries won't trust the United States to negotiate in good faith. So everyone who's promoting additional trade expansion and is disappointed at the failure of the Doha round to work in a multilateral setting has now been fantasizing about transatlantic and trans-Pacific alternatives. But within the United States, the political climate within the president's own party is not favorable for much progress there.
Jim?
Well, like I said, it's the text of the treaty is secret, so we don't really know, and that's a problem. I would also say that, you know, in light of that fact, what we can do is look at the positions that the U.S. Trade Representative has taken and some of the elements in similar treaties, and a couple of them I think are rather troubling in terms of movements for national food sovereignty and the kinds of regional and local initiatives that people here are involved with in Maine. A little over a year ago, the U.S. Trade Representative website published their latest thing that they wanted to get rid of in these agreements, and it's called localization barriers to trade. And it's basically any favoring of domestic production, and this isn't just in agriculture; it's in all areas. So that you know, potentially things like farm-to-school initiatives and government procurement programs that favor local farmers could be out in these agreements. Another major element of both of these agreements is the so-called investor-state dispute settlement mechanism, which gives corporations and investors the ability to sue national governments in a private international tribunal if changes happen in those countries, legal changes happen in those countries that disrupt normal expected profits of those international investments. And this is an extremely dangerous feature that's already being used by the tobacco industry. For instance, Philip Morris has sued Uruguay and Australian governments because after signing trade agreements with the U.S., and I'm sorry to go on so long, those governments tried to institute warning labels on cigarette packages. And of course, if people see warning labels and get scared about cigarettes, they're going to buy less and profits will go down. And according to this dispute resolution mechanism, that's grounds for a suit. And but having said all that, it's a secret, and I also agree with Bob that right now it's uncertain that anything's going to happen. Obama is in Asia now or soon trying to convince leaders that he actually has the power to push this through, but I think it's in doubt right now.
This is one of those issues that just seems so big and so beyond what average citizens can get involved in. I just want to give a plug. In Maine, we have a citizens trade commission. A lot of progressive states do, and they track these issues as closely as anyone can because a lot of the information is secret. And they've held hearings across Maine over the last 6 weeks or so on the Trans-Pacific Pact. In fact, I testified about some of the possible impacts on the dairy industry, which I think could be devastating. So this is something that even as a big international issue, you as a Maine citizen can get your head around. We're going to go now to mic 3 up in the balcony.
Hi, my name is Julia McGuire, and I am a graduate student at the University of Maine studying food systems. My question is regarding scale and power of institutions. And Rob Parlberg, you said that national institutions have the regulating upper hand which I don't dispute, but there are many examples of informal regional or local institutions regulating resources better than governments. Could you please speak to the challenges in governance of resources, specifically where there is historical conflict in successful management? Do you think that there is opportunity for collaborative governance solutions between formal and informal institutions? Thank you.
It's a huge question that I can only begin to address. Of course, one of the biggest challenges for sustainability in American agriculture is the washing of excess fertilizer applications into water systems, whether it's the Chesapeake Bay or the Mississippi Delta. And there, things like fertilizer use, because they're non-point pollutants, are not regulated by the Environmental Protection Agency. The regulations, as I understand it, have to be made state by state, and there are 6 or 7 different states along the Mississippi River basin that would have to get on board an agreement to protect that system from fertilizer runoff. And it's an extremely difficult problem. There might be some people at EPA who think they can do it by executive order from Washington, D.C., but I seriously doubt it. Our federal system in the United States has some huge pluses, but in cases like this, it has some huge deficits as well.
Anyone else want to speak to this issue? Kathleen?
So I'll give you a solution-based answer for this one. Something I was really excited to do in partnership with EPA, and Rob triggered this thought in my head. The deputy secretary there, who's still the deputy, Bob Perciasepi, is deputy administrator, and I spent 2 days before Christmas in my office, and we wrote this letter and we sent it to all of the commissioners of agriculture in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, so several states. And we said, we really want to promote the idea of certainty. You're all scared about the Clean Water Act and the TMDLs, the total daily maximum loads requirements that you have to comply with. And EPA, it's not just EPA's wanting to do it, they have law that they have to implement, and they have environmental groups very aggressively challenging the agency in the courts that they're not implementing the law, they're not fulfilling the law. So we said, if you, as a farmer, why don't you set up a system, state governments, because state governments are responsible for doing the TMDLs. If you work with your farmers and they maximize on USDA's natural resources conservation, there are conservation program initiatives, so you're doing everything that USDA knows that you can do on your farm to make it the best possible sustainable farm that can be, relating to runoff, and so you're doing windbreaks and you're doing stream buffer, you're doing a lot of different things, you're testing your soils, you're doing all the stuff that USDA helps you with, then we'll give you certainty that you won't be regulated out of business. So this is a very interesting initiative that's still somewhat immature, but it's moving forward, but it requires EPA and USDA to work together, and then it requires the states to work together with EPA. And it really is, when you're confronting some of these big challenges, it's not like one institution runs the show. And so there are all these negotiations going on, which we may not be aware of sometimes, between different levels of government to try to get to optimal solutions. So that's one I have hope for. You hear it bandied about sometimes by policymakers in Washington. It's called certainty, and it has legs, I think.
Not seeing any hands, we'll go to another question. Right over here, mic 1.
Good morning. Most of the discussion is focused on agriculture and less on water. And I suspect that a lot of the visions you're putting for sustainable agriculture won't go very far if we don't have enough water to really make them come to fruition. I'd like to have you all respond to thinking a little bit more holistically about whether we as people concerned about sustainable agriculture should always be folding in good and sound water policy, first of all, with that. And if the availability of incredibly cheap water has really led in many ways to the dilemma we face with our depleting aquifers. And then for Maine, I'd love your take on whether we are missing the boat by not recognizing that we have oil underneath our land in the form of ultra-clean aquifers. Texas got smart, and it really made a bundle on exporting its oil. Should Maine rethink our water resources as a source of income and support, since we are a water-rich state?
Two questions. Let's handle them in turn. So starting with the first one, just generally about water policy and sustainable ag and how we need to think about them holistically. Dave, we'll start with you.
Just one thought, and I know I mentioned it in some of the breakouts, but to individuals, but I really do think that at least in the Midwest, especially in the eastern Midwest of the U.S., we really do need to rethink how we're dealing with water in the sense, especially facing climate change, because what we're getting is heavier and heavier rains in the spring. Most of that water goes right down through tiles and into our rivers, causing flooding downstream. And then we get into a hot period in July, and we say, oh, gee whiz, I wish we had water right now. So I believe that there ought to be greater investment in infrastructure to hold that water, retention ponds capturing tile water and then reusing it on farm in periods when we need it. Some of that is actually happening already further south in the Mississippi Delta region, where irrigation has recently been put in place. But I know there's even questions about how sustainable those uses of water are, because there's some depletion of that particular aquifer. But in general, I do think that we need to be investing in small-scale water infrastructure to hold water for farmers in a way that isn't really happening now. And I think that's going to be one of the adaptation strategies that's going to become absolutely necessary in the future.
Others on general water policy? Kathleen?
I'll just say one of my greatest days at USDA was when I got to hang a banner that Wes Jackson and Wendell Berry brought to my office. Were you with them, Fred? No, I don't think so. So they came, okay, saw the photograph. So they came to my office, and Wes Jackson runs the Land Institute in Kansas, and he has been a preacher on perennialism for as long as I can remember, and trying to bring back the natural prairies. Anyhow, interesting, very intellectual, and a challenging guy, and I recommend his work to people. Anyhow, he brought this banner, and it was almost 2 stories high, and challenged me to hang it up at USDA. I'm like, thanks, Wes, that's really nice. But it was an annual crop versus a crop that was a perennial, and it showed the length of their roots. So the annual was hardly anything, and then the perennial was two floors high. So I said to my boss, Tom Vilsack, I'd like to hang this. And I got, everyone just thought I was a crazy woman. And about 6 months into it, I got hung in the USDA patio, which is the main event space at USDA, and it was there for about a month. But I just thought it was something we don't think enough about, perennialism, as for healthy soils, for economics, for water. My friends in California, when they do get rain, just as Dave was saying, it's just heartbreaking, because it comes and it goes, and there's just such long dry periods that when the land finally gets that rain, it's just not capable of holding it. So with climate change here, we've got to really think these things through. You put out a good challenge.
Anyone else on water generally? Andrew?
So I think the question forces us, as it should, or it's impossible to say small on this. That is, the forces operating on water supply are massive in their climate change, at least over a period of the lifetime of somebody who is my age, in my mid-40s, and certainly younger. The reality is, adaptation is important, and it will happen, and it will have some effect. But the forces at work to create water crises are just bigger than human beings are capable to resist as long as we're pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere at rates, anything like we're doing now. There's only one solution, and that is to bring climate change under control.
I want to turn to the second part of the question, which was about Maine, and none of you are experts about Maine, but I'd be really interested in your perspective. The summary to get you going is we have a lot of really good water, and we basically have no policy framework at all that regulates it.
That doesn't sound ideal.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on what we should be doing?
I think you should be talking to Jerry Brown really soon.
Well, I mean, you just said it in your comment, right? Certainly you need a governance system for water. If you are water rich and you think that people are going to be knocking at your door, you just don't want to leave it to whatever's there. But you have to be really careful. I remember reading a book on water that was put out by the National Academy of Sciences, and it really had a very interesting piece about Western water laws, first in time, first in right. I look to my lawyer friend to help me out here, but I think that's how it goes. And about tribal governments, and if they really exercise fully the power they have, how that might change the water system out west. So I think governance structures are important, but they have to be right. They have to be good, and they're not easy to construct.
Gus?
We're just looking at Maine water. And it looks like that Connecticut and New York are taxing you 5 cents a refund for this little bottle. And Maine is getting 5 cents. So other states are taxing it as well as Maine.
Well, that's the bottle refund.
That's the bottle.
Yeah.
But it's a tax.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating. You have other states have a water policy for Maine. They tax it. Maine does a little bit. But it's interesting. Poland water is.
Think about it that way.
A thought.
Yeah. Any other perspectives? We're going to go then to our next question, which is, ooh, I'm sorry. Oh. Cluster, sorry.
I just wanted to, this is a piece of information in response to the question on Maine, which is that a year ago, the Canadian Academy of Sciences published a very interesting study. It's a very comprehensive study of water as a strategic resource for Canada. I happen to be one of the reviewers, so I got a chance to see it. But there are countries that are thinking about water in the way people thought about oil 70 years ago, and maybe having a look at the way Canadians are thinking about it, because I think they have the intent to sell their water to a neighboring country.
Very good. Thank you. We're going to go up to mic 3 on the balcony.
Hi, thanks. Lost a perfect segue a moment ago. I want to get back to greenhouse gases, especially CO2, and the way it's affecting climate and the ocean especially, and just find out from anybody there whether there are any figures for a sustainable rate of energy consumption per person that we can go forward with, whether it's in joules, BTUs, barrels of oil, gallons of gasoline, equivalent units. Basically, how low do we, all of us, have to go to become sustainable? Thank you.
And I'm going to ask the panel, we want to speed things up a little bit here, so if anyone has some quick answers, let's dive in. Dave.
I have a really quick piece of information for you, which is that each individual in this room puts out or requires the energy of a 100 watt light bulb. So that's how much energy you're actually consuming. So my sort of flippant answer to your question is that's how much energy we actually need just to operate our bodies. We are far beyond that number here in the US, and other parts of the world are catching up to us really fast. So to me, long-term sustainable, and I would actually recommend a book at this point. It's The World We Made, and it's written by Jonathan Porritt. No friend of Monsanto. He actually was running Friends of the Earth in the UK for a little while, but it's a great book. he has the answer, and I've been actually trying to push it within my company, so far unsuccessfully, just full disclosure, and that's solar. And there really is no other sustainable solution for power generation in the world, and it's right in front of us all the time. But we're not currently pursuing it in the way that we need to be.
Jim, you have something quick?
Look up greenhouse development rights. Greenhouse development rights, there's a website of an organization called Eco-Equity that's looking at this issue from an environmental justice perspective, and they've talked about exactly the issue you're asking.
Anyone else? Anything quick? All right, we're going to move on right here to mic 2.
This is good morning. This is a kind of corollary to the question that was just asked. I'd love to know if you know of national or international programs which are actually dealing with CO2. How do we get rid of it? Is there a way to get rid of it? What suggestions would you have? Because it seems to be the thing that's causing most of our problems in terms of climate control.
Great. And again, I'm going to ask for some quick responses here. Andrew, we'll start with you.
So to the extent the question is how do we get CO2 that's already out there out of the air, the answers are not very good. The scientists working on this, at least the ones I've spoken to, look at me and they say, yeah, we're researching carbon capture. It's not the answer. That is, we're not close to being able to capture carbon on a scale that would matter. The research is important, but it's not a solution in the short term.
Any other comment or quick comment, question? Fred?
Just quickly, I think, again, to remind you what I said on Saturday night about solving for pattern. There isn't any one quick, easy solution to solve this. We've got to change the system. And we know what to do to change the system. We restore the biological health of soil, we restore our forests, and that doesn't necessarily mean that we take them out of food production, because agroforestry and tree crops are something we haven't even really explored yet. So there are a number of things that we have to do if we're going to solve this problem.
Rob, last word on this one.
The best thing to do is something the American political system finds it extremely difficult to do, that is to tax carbon.
Hear, hear.
So I'm all for lavish subsidies to try to promote renewables like solar and wind, and heroic regulatory efforts to make fuel efficiency of automobiles go up, and maybe even try to shut down some coal plants with executive actions that will immediately be challenged in the court system. But all of that is circling around the edges of the absolute best strategy, which is a carbon tax, an international agreement on carbon taxes that would solve the collective action problem and give governments new revenues that they could use to compensate losers, to invest R&D in non-fossil fuel energy sources, and to reduce taxes of other kinds.
Great. That's super. We're going to only have time for another few questions before we ask the panel to answer that big challenge question. Let's go up here to number 1.
With the decrease in hunger that you've seen, could you please speak to the point that international family planning has a direct correlation to that? Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, David, for talking about reproductive health care. If we do not include women's reproductive health care in the discussion of food sustainability, of water, then you are creating a silo, yet once again, which our cultures have been doing. And Callistus, if you and Robert could speak to the fact that somehow working with international family planning, letting women be in control of their reproductive health, is part of this solution in decreasing hunger in developing countries. Thank you.
Who wants to chime in? That was a little bit more of a comment than a question, but if someone does have an urgent feeling, Rob?
I just agree with the comment. I would agree with the comment made earlier that population isn't really a matter of total numbers on the planet. I'm fully in support of family assistance planning and child and maternal health interventions that make family planning much easier. But for me, it's first a human rights issue for women, then it's a child and maternal health issue, and then that only creates an opportunity that you have to exploit to make much larger investments
in the health and the education of the children that are born, so that the next generation will aspire to smaller families and to larger investments in their children. I don't really see it as a Malthusian problem. I see it as a human rights problem, a gender equity problem, and a human capital investment opportunity.
Good. Well said. Well said. Any other quick response? Seeing none, we're going to go right here to Mike 2.
If we did everything right, or most things right relative to carbon, is it even possible to stop or sufficiently retard the glacier melt? And secondly, is it possible to have a sustainable water supply in face of glacier melt?
Andrew.
So there's a sort of a meme in climate change that you sometimes get, which is, well, we have to do X or it'll be too late. The sad reality is it's never too late, and that's not a good thing. Climate change is unlikely to be an extinction event for our species. It's not guaranteed that it won't be, but it's unlikely to be, which means that no matter how bad things get, we can make it worse. So the way this ends, the way climate change comes under control is one of two ways. Either human beings, in something that resembles our current way of life, find a way to limit their greenhouse gas emissions. Or we don't, and the climate change causes us to limit our greenhouse gas emissions because our species shrinks in number, our technologies retreat, our ability to operate as societies diminish. And that will, in the same way that carbon emissions were less in the 16th century, that will drive down our carbon emissions because we will be less productive, less well-fed, less wealthy, and less healthy.
Other perspectives, comments? Okay, we had up here, I'm sorry.
Hi there, good morning. Well, I'm going to talk about healthcare. My question is about healthcare because I'm a surgeon, I'm a physician, I'm also an educator. I teach surgery at the University of Vermont and University of New England. And especially a question to Dr. Schumacher and Dr. Juma in the role of technology. It's all about healthcare, obviously, and obesity and malnutrition are almost the same thing. Obese people is malnourished. And you talked about physicians, the need for physicians being trained to educate the public, but I think that also educating the public and training the trainer, training the medical students. So are there any programs in Maine or in the rest of the union where you have in the medical schools this sort of VPAC teaching? I've been in Maine for 11 years, and I never heard of the VPAC or the vegetable pack program, for example, and I'm a physician. So are there any programs out there that teach that in medical schools? I know in Maine, in the medical schools in Maine.
I think we got your question. We have a couple of things in there. So I don't know if Gus or Kathleen or both of you want to speak to that.
Just briefly, I only know there's one hospital system in Washington, D.C. that is exploring putting a course in for training doctors doing their residency to go to clinics and work with the VPAC system, but that's the only one that I'm familiar with. The wider issue is you're a physician, the system doesn't pay you. In other words, when you see someone that's obesity of 34 BMI in the whole family, and you then are giving them under Medicare some wellness, you don't get reimbursed either for the time you spent with that patient or the farmer doesn't get reimbursed for the VPAC, so that the code does not recognize fruit and vegetables as medicine, as healthy, as equivalent to Lipitor or metformin or any of the drugs that you and your fellow doctors prescribe. A woman came up to me a few minutes ago and said her dad was 78 years old, was heavily diabetic, changed to a more vegetable diet, and now he's off all his meds. So again, it does work according to some of the early data, but you do not get reimbursed, and there's not much training, if any, in the medical fraternity.
Yeah.
Kathleen, you have a brief addition?
Well, I mean, what Gus is talking about is out there, right? It's really exciting. It's being supported by the philanthropic community, but the medical establishment is very, very, very far behind. Just this summer, the American Medical Association passed a resolution, I don't know for what it's worth, saying that in medical school, students should have to take a course on nutrition. To me, it's stunning that someone can be a doctor and not have taken any coursework in nutrition. So we have a long road to travel.
We're going to have one last question, and then we're going to turn to the panel right over here. Mic 1.
Joanne Bander, Miami and Spruce Head. It's really for Calestis and for Rob. I'd like to go back to the focus on Africa, and this might be a transition question about what can we do. The issue of the infrastructure. Rob, I think you kept repeating it like 4 times in the course of your comments, and I know you did yesterday. The rural roads, the irrigation systems. What are some of the most important steps that can be done, as far as you're concerned, within the power, let's say, of the U.S. government, if not worldwide, to try to move forward on some of the better infrastructure investments abroad?
Calestis, why don't we start with you?
Some of this is being addressed now to some degree because of the recognition that it matters, basically in 4 areas: energy, transportation, irrigation, and telecoms. And actually, telecoms has been serving as a role model, as an inspirational model, because people have seen what's happened in telecoms and are asking the same questions about what you could do in the other 3 areas. For agriculture, irrigation is really going to be key, partly because only about 4% of Africa's agriculture is irrigated. The figure for Asia is like 45 or 48%. The biggest challenge is not so much the construction, but the maintenance. And this is partly because we haven't had, as a continent, much investment in infrastructure. We've not been training engineers. So engineering education is completely underdeveloped in Africa, and that, to me, is becoming a deterrent even for those who want to invest in infrastructure, and they ask, how is it going to be maintained? And there are no engineers. So if there's anything that the state of Maine and the US could actually do is ramp up engineering education for Africans. Today, China admits something like 3,000 African students in its universities a year. A large part of that is to train them in the engineering fields. That's one part. Another part that's related to your question has to do with, in my view, looking at technologies that empower women. If you look carefully at African agriculture, the one thing that is really, really destructive is weeding. An African woman who has 1 hectare of land spends about 200 hours a year weeding. And so weeding literally breaks the backs of African women, literally. And so any technologies that can reduce weeds, control weeds, will have hugely revolutionary impact on African agriculture. This is even more critical than controlling pests. And it relates to the question that was raised earlier about empowerment of women, because if they are freed from weeding, they will go to school. Many families want more kids because they want them to go and weed. It has also implications for population growth. And so there's a role that technology can play that is directly linked to reproductive choices by families. They want more children because the children are a source of energy. And so if you can provide energy, that will create the incentive for families to actually have less children.
Rob, you were identified by Joanne as well. Do you have a quick addition?
Okay, I would just mention the one agency inside the United States government that I think has done the best job of helping African governments improve their rural infrastructure is the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which takes the extraordinary step of first asking African governments what they want, rather than telling them what they want. And when they've done that, they've learned, to their surprise, African governments want help building rural road and power infrastructure. And in Ghana in particular, U.S. taxpayer money was put to exceptionally good use doing exactly that. I'd also salute Calestis for the innovative thought of having African military establishments spend a little bit more time building infrastructure. It occurred to me when he said that well, we did that. That's the Army Corps of Engineers. And there's nothing new about that. It worked for us. It should work for them.
Great. Well, at this point, I'm going to cut off the audience questions, and we're going to begin with Andrew at the end and come down the line. And again, what I asked them to do was to give us a few thoughts on what all of us can do to help take the next step from the learning of this weekend. So, Andrew?
I think I was told, do I have 3 minutes still?
Well, let's say 2 at this point.
Okay, well, 3 was so luxurious I wanted to say 2 things, so I'm still going to do that. One is going to be less popular than the other, but it speaks to an ethics question that has been raised, among others, as well as an international prosperity question. The United States, in fact, can do one thing even more easily than give money for infrastructure or train engineers, and that is let the poor people of the world sell their agricultural products in this country on fair terms. Fair terms meaning without tariffs and fewer subsidies. The human welfare gains here are substantial. The way in which liberalized trade happens is always the same, which is that if it doesn't happen sort of by itself, it's because there are interest groups within the importing country that will be hurt. Some of those interest groups are represented in this room. And I understand that, and I don't mean, and I in no way diminish the reality of that. But to the extent policy is seeking net welfare gains, the answer is that the poorest segments of this country's population will be better served. They will get food at lower cost than under the current regime. And the producers of food in the world who have a comparative advantage will get more revenue, and they will do, the poorest people in the world will be helped. So that's thing one that's probably not the more popular one, I'm saying. Thing two is a climate change point. I agree with Rob that the answer is a carbon tax. In China, it might look more like top-down regulation, but some combination of those two is the only solution. If you imagine 25 years from now, people thinking that climate change is more or less under control, it will be because of some combination of those two policies. Cap and trade is a form of carbon tax, really. The other thing that you'll see, I think, inevitably, if this problem gets solved, so in other words, the only way to solve it, is the key players, the US, Europe, and China, have to sit at a table. And they have to sit at a table in which most of the other countries in the world are not present. You cannot do this at the Conference of the Parties of the UN with 192 countries, where every country has a veto. You need at least those 3, no more than 1 or 2 or 3 more, and a deal has to be struck. That's very hard to do, and then it has to be enforced. That's even harder to do. But that is the only path forward. That is, at least we should know the negotiating posture to be in, the groups that should sit at the table, and what the ultimate strategy looks like, which is a carbon tax, or at least well thought through regulation from the top.
Great, thank you, Andrew. Lester.
I think that the topics we've been addressing here the last 2 days are long-term societal changes. They really cannot be addressed very effectively over the short term. And we know one thing about human beings is that human beings are not very smart. Because if they were, we wouldn't be taking so long being in school. And so being able to start early is really important. And I think that early child education might hold the key to really starting to build a new ethic, new sustainability ethic, even before kids get to school. So in this respect, mothers have a very important role to play in preparing the next generation of really responsible, ecologically responsible citizens. That will make the work of teachers a lot easier in that the teachers can design new curricula, these elementary school teachers, new curricula easily without having to have fights with the parents. Parents who might think this is going to change the lifestyles of their children. And so I put this down to education, because if we can get the education right from fairly early on, you have a much better chance of uptake of new ideas and new technologies at a later time, because we know, as somebody said, human beings are very open to new ideas so long as they look just like the old ones.
Thank you.
I think I'll stop there.
Gus.
Well, very briefly, I think two. One is healthcare, and two is technology. I think we've talked about the importance of the doctors here. There's a number of doctors here that have come up to me and to talk to their COOs at their hospitals and basically get them to look at their community benefit reporting so that help you get reimbursed and help you access the time and then help you get a vegetable prescription or a VPAC. They have the money, they're just not allocating it correctly when they use their community benefit. So that's, and you can also, as citizens who visit people in hospitals, talk to your COOs and CEOs and get them to look at healthy food and have that healthy food come to help local farmers through the veggie prescription and others. And also use the community benefit to reduce readmissions. Hospitals now are mandated to reduce their readmissions if you have a bypass, or hopefully not, or pneumonia. Go into a hospital. When you leave, they don't talk to you about nutrition. So 30% of Medicare patients return in 30 days, and the hospitals now have to pay for that. So good nutrition, you can advise your hospital to put, when you leave the hospital, or your parents or someone, have them give some good, give advice on good nutrition, or maybe even buy from a local food hub and take some good food home. And then secondly is technology. I think that as we heard from many of us here that things are going to change, there's likely to be a more re-regionalization of the food system back to when my father and his father were growing food here in New England and New York. The Extension Service did a lot of work with them on varieties that were suitable for this area. I think there's the need for technology to look at those varieties that do well under Kathleen's hoop houses. There's not much research on these new crops that Ellie and Coleman started on the new varieties that will be necessary for colder climates or warmer climates in east of the Mississippi. And then finally, technology, and I'm very impressed with your talk earlier on. I learned so much here at the conference that in Kenya, you can use an iPhone or a smartphone and transfer money easily, independently of brick and mortar banks. But if you're a food stamp client or a WIC client using your EBT systems, the technology simply is very clunky to go to a farmer's market and try and use your EBT. It's all kinds of technology. We can learn a lot from Kenya on how to use smartphones to those benefits are on a smartphone as the technology changes. So that makes it a lot easier for small farmers, medium-sized farmers, to access the $704 billion that's going to be in that system. So we need a lot of work on maybe John, a pop tech, what do you call it, a system on technology to help farmers get new technology to access EBT, to get rid of these clunky 24-year-old machines.
All right, before I turn it over to Fred, what invariably we've all been part of it, have noticed when we have these kind of closing things is people get a little longer. So we're running a little out of time. So I'm just going to urge everyone from Fred on to be a little quicker. Fred?
Okay, I'll do my best. Three quick things. First of all, most of you probably don't know, one of the things that Bruce Cole and I were privileged to be part of last night was the World Kaveh event over at the First Congregational Church that the students from this conference put together. And they had three very compelling questions that they wrestled with last night. And they also had an artist in their group and who put up did a number of posters, which are now upstairs in the recreation room in the back of the building here. So I would encourage those of you who are interested to go up and take a look at them, and I would imagine a few of the students will be up there and you can have conversations with them. This next generation of young people always inspire me, and they'll inspire you as well. Secondly, and this is going to sound a little bit like a criticism, and I don't mean it, it's really more of a wake-up call. one of my concerns, there's so many incredible things that happened at this conference, and I'm going away much enriched as a result of it. But one of the concerns I have is I think that most of our conversations, not only and all of you are here, but also among the panel, is still kind of locked into something that Thomas Eagleton, who wrote the original essay in the current State of the World report, 2013. They do a report every year. This year is, in my opinion, one of the best they've ever done. And he coined, first of all, he coined a term called sustainababble, as he thinks that, which I think is appropriate in a lot of ways. But the other term that he coined in there was dreamy belief, that we still all kind of operate out of the dreamy belief that somehow, our current life, our current system can continue to go on, and we just have to kind of, tweak it a little bit here and there, and then we're going to be okay. And that's not true. We're going to be transitioning out of an industrial economy into, as Ernest Chusky calls it, a post-neocaloric economy and a post-neocaloric world. And so we're going to have to really think about not just keeping the current system going, but what we need to do to transition to the system of the future. Joseph Fixel referred to this as steady state sustainability, which he called an oxymoron, which I think is correct. That we really have to think about, and he's part of the resilience thinkers, and C.S. Hollings and others reminded us that no systems are ever stable. They always go through a series of adaptive cycles. And so the kind of management which we need to employ is adaptive management, not control management. Control management never works. And that's an attitude, I think, that we all have to kind of internalize into our thinking, into our spirits. And then finally, I think that it's important for us, as I study the history of past civilizations, we as a human species do not have a very good record of predicting the future. And so I don't think that we should use that as our way of addressing these issues. What Jared Diamond reminded us, based on his studies that he did of past civilizations, is that we do, at least as human civilizations, have some record of doing a pretty good job of anticipating the future and getting a head start preparing for that. And anticipating the future is different. You have to anticipate the various kinds of possibilities and then prepare for those. And the other thing was that he found was that those civilizations that anticipated the changes coming at them, recognized the value of their ecological capital, and got a head start preparing for that future. They were the civilizations that tended to survive. Those that failed in that exercise were the ones that tended to collapse. And so this, I think, is this is the kind of direction that I like to take in terms of my own life and what I'm trying to accomplish in all of this. And I think that's a better approach than trying to predict the future and do control management to try to make it happen. So that would be my comments. Thank you.
Kathleen?
3 practical, doable things in short time. 1, farm-to-school programs. Every community should have one. Help your community build one. If it's not there, improve the one you have. USDA has new grant money out, just announced this past week. Applications are due in May. 2, we get a lot of young people who are starting farming operations. A lot of them don't come from the farm. They're enthusiastic, but they don't necessarily have business training. They don't have a business plan. So if you're from the business community and you care about these issues, find a young farmer and contribute your time. 3, vote with your fork.
Excellent. Dave.
Well, I'll be brief, too, to get us back on schedule. Just first of all, thanks very much to the organizers, and I definitely felt a little bit like Daniel in the Lion's Den, but I appreciate folks, and I especially have a special thank you to Kathleen. We were actually joking beforehand that she would answer the Monsanto questions and I would answer the USDA. So thank you to the audience who are dying to ask that Monsanto question that you didn't have that last chance, but I will be available afterwards. But I really did want to just mention this book again, because I totally agree that we need to imagine and think more about the future than we have been generally. And this book, The World We Made, is a really cool attempt to look at that. He imagines himself being in the year 2050 and looking back on all of the really great things that happened during the first half of the 21st century, again, looking backwards, that took us from the current completely unsustainable trajectory to a truly sustainable world. And part of that is absolutely population. He imagines, for instance, the Pope coming out in favor of birth control sometime in the 2020s. So it really is a great book. And he also mentions that something like half of food production will move to urban settings by that part of the century, which I think it's a trajectory we're actually on. So that's one of the big mega trends that's coming for sure. And just really lastly, again, thanks for inviting me here, but I really would like to just say that we'd like to collaborate and talk more than we have been with folks in the room. The invitation is always open to come meet with us and for others of us to come back and keep the conversation going. I really do appreciate the opportunity. Thanks.
Rob?
Buy a ticket, get on a plane, fly to any capital city in East or West Africa, leave your hotel, hire a sturdy vehicle, head up country, get off the tarmac road, walk into a farming community, and look around you and notice how many things are missing. These people do not have any of the things that farmers in the rest of the world have used to escape poverty, to increase their productivity, to allow themselves and their children to be well fed. They don't have any electrical power, they don't have any irrigation, they don't have any transport, they don't have any fertilizer, they don't have any improved seeds, they don't have any veterinary medicine, they don't have any adequate schools or clinics, they don't have clean water to drink. And when you've seen that with your own eyes, you'll know where the deficits are, and you'll find a way to help close those deficits.
Jim?
Okay. I'll try to keep it short. Thanks to everybody for being here. I've learned a tremendous amount from all of the panelists and from the questions and discussions as well. I think there's been a lot of pessimism about this Malthusian population scenario and about climate and the inevitability of things continuing to get worse. And one of the reasons that I disagree with the inevitability of those things is that human communities are not like the colonies of rats in those Malthusian experiments that all end up, eating each other. And the reason is that we can make choices as a society. And that's called democracy. And there are a lot of choices that I think most Americans probably would want to make if our democracy was functioning the way that it was designed to. I think Americans would want to help African countries develop the infrastructure and enabling conditions their farmers need. I think Americans would want to tax carbon. I think Americans would want to get unhealthy food out of schools and stop advertisement to children of unhealthy things. The problem is we have a broken democracy. So if there was one thing I would recommend, I would say, take your privilege as an American citizen and go help fix democracy by getting the influence of money out of politics. That's the one thing.
On the board of Maine Farmland Trust, we have a little expression that we've used from the days we were founded 15 years ago. We talk about creating a barely restrained mob that's demanding that we do what's right by agriculture. And I think Jim's comments just made me think of that. We all need to be part of that group that are demanding that we do what's right. I want to thank the panel. Amazing.